My question concerns something which hasn't been raised so far, and that's the what seems to be a growing collusion at times between church and state in Russia. One such example of that might be the very repressive anti-gay laws, which no doubt the church would have had some input into. So could you please comment on this whole situation and whether it's something that you expect to keep growing or whatever?
Yes, you're right. There has been a growth in cooperation between the church and state, particularly since Putin has come to power. There's been an attempt by the state to co-opt the church into the message that I talked about of Russian traditions, because orthodoxy is clearly seen as one of the main struts of that Russian traditionalism. And what the state has got from it has been basically support from the church for all of the policies that it's pursued. What the church has got has been a truckload of property in right across Moscow and right across the country. So that a lot of the churches that were closed down during the Soviet period were restored to the Orthodox Church, and the wealth of the church is enormous. I mean, if you go and you stand on the lookout looking over Moscow now near the university, on a sunny day, what you get is the glare from the brightness of all of the gold cupolas, most of which are new. So the church has got a lot of property. It's also got a number of policies which the state has adopted, which have clearly been at the instigation of the church. The most important one in terms of the church's outlook has been the restriction upon other churches opening up. What the state did was to decide that there were 4 official religions in Russia, and they were the religions that were most prominent during Tsarist period. So it's Orthodoxy, Judaism, Islam and Buddhism, and any other religion is classed as a sect, and it therefore comes under certain sort of regulations which restrict what they can do. Whether the anti-gay legislation is a function of the church or not, I'm not sure. I think the church would certainly go along with it, but I think there's a pretty substantial anti-gay sentiment there anyway, regardless of what the church thinks.
I agree with Graham's comments in terms of the foreign policy aspect of the anti-gay legislation and co-optation of the church. I think it's important to note that this is a way that Russia and Russian leadership and Putin can distinguish itself from the West, and say we are not the West, we're culturally not the West, we don't have these decadent and immoral practices like homosexuality. You get this language used quite directly and bluntly by Putin and by church leaders and by many of the Russian elite, and it's really acceptable in Russia to see this kind of language. It's really the mainstream, and it has a lot of traction with regular Russians, unfortunately. So it really also plays into the foreign policy aspect of strengthening the sense of threat from the West and distinction from the West.
My question is about another, let's say, major institution or major group in Russia that wasn't mentioned. That's to say the oligarchs. The oligarchs who I think largely got their wealth from one of the most corrupt privatizations in world history. And my question is, has Putin, what's the relationship between Putin and the oligarchs, if we may describe them as a class? Has he co-opted them? Is he in conflict with them? Is he seeking to renationalize state assets? Is there a further privatization of state assets coming down the track? Thank you.
Have I got a deal for you, fellas? If you pay your taxes, you do not become involved in politics, and you begin to conduct some sort of philanthropic activities, if you do those three things, I will not look at the privatisations of the 1990s. Three of the oligarchs thought he was joking. Boris Berezovsky had to flee to London, losing control over the companies he had. Vladimir Gusinsky fled to Israel and lost control over the companies that he had. Mikhail Khodorkovsky was arrested and put in the slammer and was released last year. Nobody else has dared Putin since then. But what we've seen has been the emergence of a new class of oligarchs. But these oligarchs are different from the old ones in that they are many of them essentially came from within the state, and they moved in to take up managerial positions in private companies by moving onto the boards of those companies, which meant that the state did not have to privatise them. It had that control over them through the board. A number of others were simply parachuted in as managing directors of private companies and also of the state corporations. But the net effect of it has been that by and large the oligarchs, such as they are, now toe the line to Putin, and most have gained their positions as a result of Putin and therefore owe him. In about maybe 2008, I might be wrong on the year, the Russian government issued a list of 1,300 companies which it said it wanted to take a major stake in. And in taking a major stake in them, what it did was to establish a sufficient position within that sector of the economy that it did not need to actually physically own the companies. The state's will would be sort of looked after. So what you have is a system which is a mix of private and state and semi-state. At the lower levels, in small business and medium business, it's mainly private. At the upper levels, it is either private but run by somebody who is close to Putin, for example, Abramovich, the man who owns Chelsea Football Club. People who are close to Putin, people who work within the state system and therefore are beholden to Putin. So basically what you have is that sort of system, so that he's completely undercut the power of the oligarchs and the power of private capital.
I can add a little as well, again, about the international implications. What's really interesting now is that the sanctions that the US and Europe hope will have some effect on Russian behavior are going to hit the interests of these groups, these oligarchs, and their profits in some cases quite directly. And the really interesting question is how this will affect the system that Graham has described. You know, will it still be a system that's dominated by Putin, or will the oligarchs maybe get together or see a common interest and either prevail on the leadership to change its behavior so that these sanctions are removed, or will it create more open conflict between the leaders of the economy and the more right-wing, ideologically or nationalistically motivated parts of the system?
I'd like to ask a question about the living standards for people. not the oligarchs, just the ordinary people of Russia. Under Putin, have the living standards increased, decreased, about the same? And I'd like you to respond with particular reference to their health system, their education system, their pension system. I'd like to know that very much. Have they increased, decreased, or has it remained more or less just the same?
Living standards,
Broadly speaking.
it's different. It's not the same picture across the country. Living standards in the big cities, in particular in Moscow and St. Petersburg, continued to improve. During the 2000s, there was a setback in 2008 when the economy had a major ruction, but that was the same here. But by and large, people, the sort of middle class, if I can call them that, the middle class is probably better off in 2010 than they were in 2000, in terms of their standard of living, how they can get by, the money they have in their hand. The education system has always been good. It suffered from major deficits of funding during the 1990s. Those deficits have been not completely replaced, but it's been improved on what it was. But you know, the quality of the infrastructure, the quality of the people who are doing the teaching still remains quite high. Pensions are now being paid, which they weren't in Yeltsin's time all the time. So that's good. Health system. The best indication of that is that for the first time, I think we've now had 12 months where I always get this term wrong, but the average age to which a Russian male lives has been going up. Towards the end of the Soviet period and in the early 1990s, the average age of a Russian male that they could hope to reach was about 58. It's now about, I think, 71, and for women it's about 75. So that suggests that there have been improvements in the health system. There have been improvements in other sort of things which contribute to that as well, but that's what's been happening. The less satisfactory side is that in the countryside, conditions are really pretty dire. In many parts of the country, what we're seeing is an outflow of population, so that villages are dying. With the collapse of the collective farm system, which was the Soviet one, which actually sort of locked people into the countryside, with the collapse of that system, what we've seen is increasing numbers of people, particularly young people, going into the cities, and that's meant that the countryside is left with the old, the sick, the people who really can't care for themselves very well. So it really is a mixed bag.
The recent downing of MH17, who do you think shot it down? Was it the Russians or the Ukrainians? Now, obviously the West blames the Russian, the sophistication of the missile at what, 33,000 feet. Would the Ukrainian have such sophisticated equipment? I saw a piece being written that says that actually it was done by the Ukrainian because they mistook the colors of the plane, the red and blue, as that of Putin flying over. This is not conspiracy, but what do you think? Now, the other thing I want to quickly ask is that you can see the closeness between the Chinese leadership and the Russians now. They were not the best of friends, but the recent signing of the treaty to sell oil and gas bypassing Europe and the United States, what repercussions will it have for the West?
Okay, two questions, distinct questions. So, you know, I mean, of course, we can only judge by the information we get in the news media and from official reports and all that. But it seems at least to me, pretty clear based on the evidence that the missile came from the rebel-controlled territory, that it was a rebel-controlled, it was a mistake by the rebels. Thinking they were shooting down another Ukrainian military plane and actually shooting down a civilian airliner. And the Ukrainians do have the capability, the exact same missiles that were used, but the Europeans and the U.S. and the intelligence reports say that, and the Ukrainians say their missiles, those missiles were not in that place at that time, and I think it's pretty plausible that their missiles were not in rebel-controlled territory. And it seems pretty clear also from the information the Ukrainian government released and the recordings of the rebels discussing what to do with the black box, etc., that it was a mistake, but it was the separatist rebels using equipment probably supplied by Russia. On the second question, I think I would say that the common interests between China and Russia are not really as strong as we might think. I mean, Chinese and Russians have really divergent interests, and a lot of that, I think it's quite a positive thing. China's interests are tied so much to the global trade system and to exporting, not to Russia, which is not a huge market for Chinese exports, but to the U.S. and Europe and other markets. And Chinese interests are in stability and less conflict. So although certainly China and Russia could find common cause on some particular issues, the agreement that was reached, it was really quite interesting. Took a while to negotiate. The negotiations took quite a long time, and neither side released the price that China was willing to pay for Russian energy resources, and that I take that as an indication that China drove a very hard bargain. And so Russia, I think the big, I think probably what's happening, and I think what is a positive thing that's happening, is Russia is going to pay a high economic price, even though Europe and the U.S. will not challenge Russia militarily regarding taking Crimea. The economic price will be high, and China will understand that the economic price is high for that kind of action.
I've got a slightly different take on both those. We don't know who shot it down. I think it probably is the rebels who shot it down. The Ukrainians actually said, I can't remember exactly how long before, but before MH17 was shot down, that they had a Buk missile installation which was seized by the rebels. The Buk missile was the one that shot the plane down, which was seized by the rebels, but it was not operative. Okay, it might not have been operative when the rebels shot it down, but it might have been operative when they used it. So, I mean, I think the rebels shot it down. I think where the weapons came from remains unclear. And I go even further, that I do not trust what the Ukrainians say. And I have significant question marks very often over what Moscow says, and I treat what the US State Department says with even more skepticism. Because I mean, if you look at the statements that they've made ever since the problems in eastern Ukraine developed, they have run a consistent line. Putin's doing it. Putin's doing it. Show us the evidence. There is no evidence. There is no evidence. It may be the case that Russian fighters are there. It may be the case that Russia has sent weapons and material in. show us the evidence. The picture that the State Department produced that purported to show the Buk missiles going over the border to Russia was taken in a Ukrainian town. You can tell by the signs that are there. So at this stage, there is no concrete evidence that tells us that the Russians are clearly behind it. To argue that this is all something that Putin has stirred up does something that has two really bad effects. One is it poisons the relationship between Russia and the West, that is the US and the European Union. I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. The other thing is that it covers up what is basically a major political problem in Ukraine. If you look at Ukrainian politics since 1991, there has been a division, political division between how eastern Ukraine votes and how the rest of the country votes. And no government, be it headed by someone from the east or someone from the rest of the country, no government's been able to create a sense of Ukrainian identity which will unite both parties. And that's the issue. It's not what Putin's doing in the Kremlin. It's the problem on the ground in Ukraine that needs to be resolved. And if Putin does not go in with major force, the rebels are going to get defeated militarily. The problem is what comes after that. What's the Ukrainian government going to do? How is it going to handle it? Is it going to try and deal with that problem or not? It remains to be seen. On the other thing about the West, China and that sort of thing, I mean, I think the danger is that all right, Russia and China may not have much in common, but the thing they do have in common is that they're both being criticised and challenged by the US.
Big time.
And they've got a few allies. If you have a look at the vote in the UN General Assembly on Russia's takeover of Crimea, the vote was, I can't remember the exact figures, but I'm giving you sort of the order of magnitude. Thank you. Order of magnitude. Supporting the resolution criticising Russia's takeover is around about sort of 90 to 100. Opposing it's about 11. Looks overwhelming. What are the other 80 doing? The other 80 countries abstained or were not there for the vote. That means that only half of the UN General Assembly was willing to take a decision which criticised the changing of borders by military force. That doesn't look to me like a consensus. And if you look at the developments that have gone on, I mean, there's the energy agreement that Ben talked about. Have a look at the BRICS meeting that was held in South America 2 weeks ago, something like that. What they did was to set up an organisation based in Shanghai, which is effectively the equivalent of the World Bank. Now, if that takes off, and if China becomes as powerful as it may, because it might fall apart too, we don't know, but if it becomes as powerful as it may become, and if Russia continues to be alienated from the West, and much of the third world opposes what they see as American hegemonism, what we're looking at is not the West being able to stand up to Russia and say, you were doing the wrong thing. Because after all, they're on very shaky ground when they do that. They may not have changed state borders, but through military force they've changed governments. Think Libya, think Iraq. In that sort of situation, what we may see develop is a separate, different sort of world system to the one that we have now, a different sort of international architecture. And it seems to me that that is the real danger of the way in which the process may be developed.
Cannon, my question relates to Vladimir Putin.
and is him attending the G20. I believe Vladimir Putin, the BRICS alliance, and their new World Bank is the biggest threat to the international banksters, predatory IMF, and their one world government, new world order agenda. Whenever a major event happens, like the takedown of MH17, the first thing you have to ask yourself is who benefits. With Putin attending the G20, I'm worried that there's a possibility that Australian and Dutch forces could be attacked and possibly killed to give Tony Abbott a reason to bar Putin from the G20. I'd just like to know your thoughts on that. The international bankers would do anything in their powers to stop Putin attending and to make his name mud.
I think to bar Putin from the G20 would be self-defeating. You never win an argument by excluding the person from it. You've got to bring them here and you've got to talk to them about it. If you think they're behaving badly, you've got to bring them and talk to them about it. I don't think I've ever been called a Tony Abbott supporter, but I don't think he would go that far.
NATO was actually set up not basically as an aggressive formation to oppose the Soviet Union, and I think that the interpretation that NATO and the policymakers made a mistake in regard to Russia, I would tend to disagree with that. I think that's actually the purpose of NATO, is to surround and control Russia, and they weren't going to let, in their view, they won the Cold War, they're not going to allow Russia to become stronger in its new capitalist phase. So I think that's all played out now in the Ukraine, because I think it's not only a question of NATO, but the role of the EU in Ukraine. It's been a political offensive by Europe and the United States in Ukraine that's been the background of this whole development. Just two quick other points. One, the Crimea is really a separate question. Crimea was only handed over, it's not historically Ukrainian, it was handed over to Ukraine in 1956, I understand, by Khrushchev for unknown reasons. So that's a special question. But I think
it's not a question.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I would just like to get your opinion on the current situation, where you think things are going to go in Ukraine, especially since one thing the media has not pointed out recently is that the main problem the Australian Federal Police and the Dutch Federal Police can't get to this site is because of the offensive by the Ukrainian army. It's not actually the separatists who are stopping them getting in, it's the Ukrainian army has decided to take advantage of the situation and try to crush the separatists. That's the fundamental context in which they're not able to get to this plane.
Your comment highlights the real difficulty of perceptions and understanding intentions in international politics. And so, for some, the intentions of NATO might clearly be defensive, but from the Russian perspective and from your perspective, that doesn't seem credible. And I think that's a fundamental point to keep in mind, that although leaders in the US and Germany and in Western countries might see it as self-evident, which I think they actually do, that NATO is a defensive organization. It's not going to try and invade Russia and take Moscow or something like that. If you're sitting in Moscow, that you really can't be assured of that. And politically as well, in both parts of the world, making, as some say, making political hay, or making issues of these differing perceptions is sort of what really matters. And so if you can play up the defensive nature of NATO or the offensive nature of NATO in different places, it can have real political traction and lead to events.
I need clarifications about keeping saying that behavior, Russians' behavior, Putin's behavior? How are we comparing behavior with whom? Whom are we comparing behavior?
The issue of looking at the behaviour of Russians has been something that has been a difficult thing for the West ever since the Czarist period. If you look back, you can argue that that a lot of Western defence policy during the post-1917, post-First World War period, a lot of it in Europe was predicated on the view that Russia was this peasant country that had an enormous army, and that army was just going to get up and just walk to the Atlantic. And what are we going to do if they do it? And they did not have a clue until they developed nuclear weapons. And then nuclear weapons was seen to be the key. But the thing that was behind it all the time, and there was good reason for this, is that the Soviet Union, as Russia was then, was a hostile power. And the Soviet Union was a hostile power in the sense that it believed, at the best, put it on its most anodyne, that its system was better than the Western one, and therefore it was going to overtake it. At its worst, of course, the assumption was that the Soviet military was going to expand and take over the West. Now that latter thing was never a possibility, I don't think. They were never going to do that. That was never the intention. But you've got to remember that and this gets back to the point about Tony Abbott, I suppose. Politicians playing domestic politics are playing a different game to the game that they play in the international sphere. Some of them assume that what they say domestically does not have to carry into the international sphere, but it does, because they get locked into these sorts of positions. And so very strong anti-communist positions in the US during the Cold War, which were done at least in part for domestic political reasons, also carried over into the international sphere. And the danger is that that's what will happen now. And on the EU, someone said about the EU I think has got a lot to answer for in terms of the way in which the Ukrainian crisis has unrolled since November of last year. Because the way that the crisis developed was structured by the positions that the EU took and the options that the EU gave to the Ukrainian government towards the end of 2013.
I just have a quick comment, sort of to echo one of Graham's comments about the Ukrainian government. I mean, one of the things that the Ukrainians have been saying recently is that they're not bombing civilians and that they're not bombing civilian areas, and there's really clear evidence that it's Ukrainian Air Force. There's no rebel Air Force, and it's not Russian planes that are bombing Donetsk and bombing civilian populations. So I echo the mistrust of the statements of the Ukrainian government that are, I mean, it needs to be acknowledged, are in the vein of strong nationalist sentiment and not boding well for the post-Civil War period, if we can be optimistic enough to say that there will be a post-Civil War period fairly soon. So it is, it's actually quite important what happens after the end of the conflict. But I would bet money. I use lots of statistical analysis and probability, and you often talk about what would you bet money on? What's the probability? I would bet money that after the defeat of the rebels, if that actually happens, that the Ukrainian government would quickly moderate their policies and try to create openings and sort of, generous decentralization policies that they have been proposing all along to the east to bring that part of the country back in. But that's, I'm perennially optimistic and very often wrong. But that's my final comment, hopefully optimistic.
I think Ukraine took down Flight MH17 as well.
This is a yes and no answer, so I'll be very quick. Professor Gill, you spoke about the self-censorship that you are now seeing in Russia, but how much of that, do you think that's actually part of a world trend? Because everything you said about Putin's Russia, you could also say about Orban's Hungary, and frankly, there is so much self-censorship in Australia. I mean, look at the ABC, not to mention any other media. So how much of that, or do you believe that this is actually part of a world trend and not just symptomatic of Russia?
Good question.
Well, Hungary certainly fits your position. I don't know. I don't know that it's a world trend. I mean, I think these things sort of fluctuate a little bit.